In early 1628, somewhere in a shipyard in Stockholm, 30 men were told to run back and forth across the deck of a brand new warship. Side to side, port to starboard, as fast as they could. This was a heeling test. The idea was simple. If the ship rocked too much under the shifting weight of 30 grown men, it probably wasn't safe to sail. The ship rocked too much. After 3 passes, Vice Admiral Claes Fleming ordered the test stopped. The ship was rolling so far that if they kept going, it might have capsized right there at the dock. Now, at this point, you'd think somebody would say, "Okay, maybe we've got a problem here. Maybe we should figure out what's wrong before we put hundreds of people on this thing and send it out to sea." Nobody said that. The ship sailed anyway. On August 10, 1628, on its very first voyage, in front of crowds of spectators lining the Stockholm waterfront, the most expensive and most heavily armed warship Sweden had ever built, traveled about 4,300 feet from shore, caught 2 gusts of wind, heeled over to port, took on water through its open gun ports, and sank. The whole thing took about 20 minutes. Somewhere between 30 and 50 people died. The ship's name was Vasa. It had taken 3 years to build. It had 64 bronze cannons, over 700 hand-carved sculptures, and enough space for 145 sailors and 300 soldiers. It was as tall as a 5- or 6-story building. Roughly 1,000 oak trees went into its hull, and it lasted 20 minutes. I'm David, and you're watching Phoenix. In this video, we're going to look at how the most powerful warship of its era managed to sink before it even left the harbor, who was actually to blame for it, and how the ship sat forgotten at the bottom of Stockholm harbor for over 300 years, until one man with a homemade core sampler decided to go looking for it. The story starts in 1611 when Gustav II Adolf became King of Sweden at the age of 16. Sweden was fighting wars on multiple fronts. The 30 Years' War was about to consume most of Europe, and Gustav needed to dominate the Baltic Sea. To do that, he needed the biggest and most powerful warships he could get. In 1625, a contract was signed with a Dutch master shipbuilder named Henrik Heibertson, along with his partner Ernst de Koodt. The work began at the Blasieholmen shipyard in Stockholm, and from the start, the project had a problem that would follow it all the way to the bottom of the harbor. The king wanted modifications. Specifically, he wanted a second gun deck. The Vasa was originally designed with 1 row of heavy cannons. Gustav wanted 2. That's a lot of extra weight, and all of it sitting high up on the ship. It's like stacking heavy furniture on the upper floors of a building without reinforcing the foundation. Then in 1627, Hubertson died before the ship was finished. A man named Hein Jakobsen took over the build. So now you've got a ship being completed by someone who didn't design it, built to modified specifications demanded by a king who wasn't a shipbuilder, with no way to mathematically check whether any of it would actually float properly. Wow, that last point is important. In the 1620s, there were no mathematical methods for calculating ship stability. Ships were built by experience and rules of thumb. If a master builder had made 10 ships that floated fine, he'd make the 11th the same way, and hope for the best. The Vasa was bigger than anything Hubertson had built before. He was scaling up without the math to check his assumptions. It would be over 100 years before a French mathematician named Pierre Bouguer published the first proper theory of ship stability in 1746. So the heeling test failed. The ship was clearly unstable. And it sailed anyway. Its captain Sørfring Hansen was at the helm. The weather that day wasn't particularly bad. The Vasa was supposed to cross Stockholm harbor to the naval station at Älvsnabben. It made it about 4,300 feet. 2 gusts of wind hit the ship. It heeled hard to port. The lower gun ports, which were open, was sitting only about 3 feet above the waterline. That's roughly the height of a kitchen table. Water poured in through those ports, and that was it. The ship went over. The masts were visible above the surface for a while afterward. Some people managed to swim or grab onto debris. Many didn't. An inquiry was held. Captain Hansen testified. The shipbuilders were questioned. But in the end, nobody was formally blamed. The king had ordered the design. You don't blame the king. Some historians have argued this was a genuine conclusion. Others call it a political cover-up to protect Gustav's reputation. Either way, the Vasa was gone. Well, most of it. Between 1663 and 1665, an English diver named Ian Bulmer led a salvage operation using diving bells and managed to haul up most of the 64 bronze cannons. After that, the wreck was more or less forgotten. For nearly 300 years, nobody knew exactly where it was, or particularly cared. Enter Anders Franzen. He was a petroleum engineer by trade, not a professional archaeologist. But he had an obsession with Swedish shipwrecks and had spent years researching historical records to figure out where lost ships might be sitting on the seabed. One key thing worked in his favor. The Baltic Sea has very low salinity, which means Teredo navalis, the shipworm that devours wooden wrecks in saltier oceans, doesn't survive well there. Franzen figured that wooden warships in Stockholm harbor might still be largely intact. In 1956, after years of searching, Franzen lowered a core sampler into the water at a spot he'd identified from old records. It came back up with a piece of blackened oak. He'd found the Vasa! The following year, divers went down to take a look. What they saw was remarkable. The ship was standing upright on the seabed, about 105 feet down. After 328 years, it was still essentially in one piece. Getting it out took another 4 years. Divers dug 6 tunnels under the hull and threaded steel cables through them. Over a series of 16 careful lifts, the wreck was gradually moved into shallower water. On April 24, 1961, the Vasa broke the surface. It had been underwater for 333 years. From the English Civil War to the Space Age. Crowds gathered, cameras rolled, and Sweden had its warship back. What came out of the water along with the hull was staggering. Over 40,000 individual artifacts. Clothing, leather shoes, coins, gaming pieces, food remains, a medicine chest. The remains of at least 15 to 25 individuals were found inside. People who had been trapped below decks when the ship went over. Their bones showed signs of the lives they'd lived. Healed fractures, evidence of hard labor, malnutrition. Between 2005 and 2012, forensic anthropologists created facial reconstructions from some of these skulls, putting faces on people who had been dead for nearly 400 years. Over 95% of the original ship had survived. That's almost unheard of for a wooden vessel this old. But keeping it that way turned into its own challenge. Waterlogged wood doesn't just dry out nicely. If you let it air dry, it cracks, shrinks, and falls apart. So from 1962 to 1979, 17 straight years, conservators sprayed the entire ship with polyethylene glycol, a synthetic wax that slowly replaces the water inside the wood cells. It's now the standard treatment for waterlogged archaeological wood around the world. And the Vasa project is a big reason why. In 1990, the Vasa Museum opened. The architects, Marianne Dahlbeck and Göran Monsen, designed the building around the ship. It fills the whole space. You can walk around it on multiple levels, looking at the hull from below, at eye level, and from above. The museum is now one of the most visited in Scandinavia. But in the early 2000s, conservators noticed something worrying. White and yellow crystals were forming on the surface of the wood. Analysis showed these were sulfate salts, produced by a chemical reaction between iron from the ship's original bolts and sulfur compounds in the wood. Left unchecked, this reaction produces sulfuric acid, which would slowly eat the ship from the inside. It's an ongoing problem. Museum staff carefully control the temperature and humidity to slow the reaction. But the iron-sulfur crisis, as it's been called, hasn't been solved. It's being managed. This is the strange reality of the Vasa. It existed as a functioning warship for about 20 minutes. It's been a museum piece for over 60 years. And the question of whether it can survive another 400 is genuinely open. The hull is incredibly heavy and rests on a steel cradle. There are concerns about whether it's slowly sagging or warping over time. 3D scanning and digital monitoring help track any changes. But wood treated with PEG behaves differently than untreated wood. And we're still learning what that means over the long term. There's something worth sitting with here. The Vasa is now used as a case study in engineering schools around the world. It shows up alongside the Titanic, the Challenger disaster, and the Boeing 737 MAX as an example of what happens when political or commercial pressure overrides engineering judgment. The warning signs were there. The heeling test failed. The gun ports were too close to the water. The ship was top-heavy. And nobody stopped it because the king wanted his warship. And you didn't tell the king no. Gustav II Adolf wasn't even in Stockholm when the Vasa sank. He was in Prussia fighting another war. He died 4 years later at the Battle of Lutzen in 1632. He was 37. There's a certain irony in a king who staked so much on military power, dying in the same decade as his greatest warship, both taken down by forces that were, in hindsight, fairly predictable. The Vasa also helped pioneer the entire field of maritime archaeology. There's a certain irony in a king who staked so much on military power, dying in the same decade as his greatest warship, both taken down by forces that were, in hindsight, when the Mary Rose, an English warship that sank in similar circumstances in 1545, was raised in 1982. The techniques used were directly inspired by the Vasa recovery. The conservation science that came out of Stockholm is now standard practice for shipwrecks worldwide. 3 years to build, 20 minutes to sink, 333 years on the bottom. And now a ship that was a total failure in its own time is one of the most valued objects in Sweden. There's probably a lesson in there somewhere about how we measure the worth of things. The Vasa was useless as a warship. But as a window into the 17th century, the lives of ordinary sailors, the ambitions of kings, and the consequences of ignoring what the evidence is telling you, it turns out to be priceless. And it's still teaching us things. We're just not done learning yet.